We were prey before we became hunters, fragile bodies standing against a world of claws and teeth. For millions of years, our hands were empty, our survival balanced on endurance, unity, and the will to persist. The first battles of humanity were not fought with spears, but with fear, patience, and voice. Step back in time to the age before weapons, when the human spirit itself was our only shield. They say humanity is the most dangerous animal on Earth. But what if we strip away the inventions, the blades, the fire-hardened spears, the bows that whisper through forests, the iron that carved empires? What if we return to the time before all that, when our ancestors had only skin, bone, and willpower to face a world of predators? Imagine standing barefoot in the grasslands of Africa 2 million years ago, armed with nothing but empty hands, a fragile body, and the stubborn spark of survival. That was once the reality of our kind. And somehow, against every calculation of nature, we endured. The paradox is haunting. We were the weakest of hunters, yet we endured among the strongest of beasts. A lion's teeth can shatter bone. A leopard can climb and vanish with a single kill. Even a wild dog, lean and tireless, can outrun us. We had none of these gifts. Our nails were blunt, our jaws delicate, our muscles, compared to a chimpanzee's, laughably small. Yet still, the record of bones and ash whispers that we survived battles not by claw or horn, but by a mysterious art of persistence. Archaeology reminds us of the stark truth. Before the stone tools of Olduvai, before fire pits carved the darkness, there was a long stretch of time when human hands were empty. Fossilized scratches on bones tell us that our ancestors scavenged, daring to creep close to carcasses left by lions and hyenas. But there were also moments when survival demanded confrontation, when a predator came too close, when food could not simply be stolen, when survival meant facing the threat with nothing but the body itself. How did they fight? How did the fragile endure? One answer lies in endurance. Unlike the great cats, we did not need to ambush and overpower. The human body, stripped of fur, sweats in a way no other mammal can. This meant that in the heat of the day, when predators sought shade, we could keep moving. We could walk after an antelope until its legs trembled, its breath shortened, and it collapsed, not pierced by a spear, but undone by relentless pursuit. This was not a battle of claws, but a battle of time. The weapon was not steel, but patience. To fight without weapons was to fight with the earth itself, the heat, the dust, the miles. But what about when we ourselves were cornered? Here, anthropology gives glimpses into the strategies of the barehanded. Early humans often lived in groups, and there is power in many bodies moving as one. Even chimpanzees, our close relatives, can drive away leopards by mobbing together, hurling sticks, baring teeth, raising their voices in unison. Our ancestors likely did the same, turning weakness into theater, making their bodies appear larger, louder, and more dangerous than they truly were. It was a gamble of psychology, not brute force. Against an animal stronger than any single human, survival meant bluffing with courage. And yet, bones carry other stories. Some fossilized remains show healed injuries from claws and teeth. Wounds that would have been fatal to other animals were survived by humans who lived in groups that tended one another. To fight with nothing was not only to resist in the moment, but to endure after the fight ended. A wounded body could still live because others helped it. This, too, was a weapon. Community itself. The ability to care for the injured, to keep them alive until they healed, meant that we carried our battles not alone, but together. But imagine the fear of that moment. The night echoing with the roar of a lion circling too near, or the rustle of a hyena in the grass. There is no fire yet, no sharpened stone. Just hands, trembling, just voices, rising, just the beating heart of a creature that had no right to stand in the savannah, yet refused to vanish. To fight with nothing was to stand at the edge of extinction and choose, somehow, to remain. What strange wisdom did we carry in those first desperate struggles, long before the weapons we now take for granted? Did we learn that weakness itself can be turned into a form of strength? Did we discover that survival does not always belong to the sharpest teeth, but to the most patient will? This was the paradox that shaped us. A fragile body surviving among giants, a species that fought not with talons, but with time. And though we later learned to sharpen stone, to kindle fire, to forge blades, the truth is that long before those inventions, we had already begun to win battles in another way, not by overpowering, but by outlasting, not by killing, but by enduring. The echo of those early struggles lingers in us still. Every time we run farther than we thought possible, every time we endure pain and yet continue, every time a group bands together to protect its own, we are reliving the battles of a time when there were no weapons, only the naked human spirit against the wild. But what deeper lessons, hidden in that ancient theater of survival, did we carry forward into the ages of tools and empires? And what wisdom did we perhaps lose when we first sharpened stone into blade? The fight without weapons was not only against beasts, it was also against the elements, against the relentless landscape that tested every breath and step. To live on the open plains meant to endure the sun by day and the cold by night. Where predators had claws, we had only skin that burned, cracked, and chilled. The battle was constant, not for dominance, but for survival. And perhaps this is where the story of humanity's earliest fighting spirit truly begins. Not in the clash of fang and flesh, but in the quieter war against the world itself. Consider the storms of East Africa 2 million years ago. Sudden rains would swell rivers and scatter animals. Lightning split the skies. A flash flood could sweep away a camp with no warning, while drought could parch the land for weeks. There were no shelters of stone, no roofs of thatch, yet the human body stood exposed, a frail outline against horizons that seemed to stretch forever. How did they resist such forces? They did not conquer them, they endured them. Naked against the earth, early humans learned the subtle skill of adaptation. To fight without weapons meant to bend without breaking, to yield to storms yet rise again once they passed. Endurance was not only physical, it was social. When the rains failed, when animals grew scarce, the choice was stark: fight one another for scraps, or endure together. Evidence from the earliest camps shows that sharing was not an invention of farming societies, but a practice older than tools themselves. Bones from ancient sites sometimes carry cut marks, suggesting that meat was divided and distributed. To fight with nothing meant to recognize that even hunger could be shared, that survival was a group act. In the absence of weapons, unity itself was a shield. But there were moments when endurance was not enough. Imagine the shadow of a leopard descending in the night, jaws closing on a child, dragging it into the brush. These encounters must have been frequent, sudden, and terrifying. Here, the human body was not only fragile, it was prey. And yet some must have fought back. A stone grasped in panic, a stick swung in desperation, hands clawing at fur and teeth. These were not weapons yet, but gestures of defiance, the raw instinct to resist even when defeat seemed certain. Perhaps many died this way, but some survived. And each survival carved a new thread into the fabric of our species, the idea that to be human was to resist the inevitable, even when powerless. Anthropology offers us haunting glimpses of this struggle. Fossil evidence from South Africa shows that hominins were often preyed upon. The skull of a child known as the Taung child, over 2 million years old, carries puncture marks likely made by an eagle's talons. Even from the sky, death fell upon us. Yet we did not vanish. If anything, such relentless vulnerability may have sharpened another kind of survival strategy. awareness. Eyes that scanned the horizon, ears tuned to the faintest rustle, bodies that slept lightly and stirred at the snapping of a twig. In the absence of claws, vigilance became its own defense. And there is another weaponless fight, subtler still, the one waged through the voice. Long before words took shape, early humans likely used cries, chants, and rhythms of sound to signal danger, to drive away predators, to unify groups in the darkness. Many primates today raise alarm calls when predators approach, each sound distinct to the threat. It is not hard to imagine our ancestors, gathered under the night sky, shouting together, their voices merging into a single wave of defiance. Against a lion's roar, they answered not with silence but with human sound. The voice, unarmed yet unyielding, became the echo of survival. Yet what is most remarkable is how these struggles shaped not only the body, but the spirit. Fighting without weapons forged a certain relationship to fear. Predators instilled terror, storms scattered everything, hunger hollowed the bones. Yet in facing these endlessly repeating trials, humans became creatures that did not collapse in the face of dread, but carried it, bore it, and continued. Fear did not vanish. It became the background hum of existence. To live was to walk with it, and perhaps this too is a weapon, not one that strikes, but one that endures. But endurance has its cost. The fossil record also whispers of broken bones, of lives cut short. Many hominins never lived past 30 years. Infant mortality was high. Each generation had to fight, unarmed, into a future uncertain. And yet, generation after generation, they did. Was it stubbornness? Was it chance? Or was it the birth of something greater, the human refusal to yield, even when all logic said extinction was inevitable? We can still imagine the moments vividly. A lone figure, separated from their group, stalked by a hyena in the twilight. The hyena circles closer, teeth glinting. The human bends to pick up a stick, not shaped, not sharpened, just lifted from the earth. They raise it high, shout, and step forward. The hyena pauses, uncertain. Perhaps it retreats, perhaps it lunges. The outcome remains hidden in the dust of prehistory, but the gesture itself, the decision to stand, unarmed against the wild, is what mattered. It was not yet a weapon, but it was a seed. From such gestures across countless nights and countless lives, the idea of weapons would one day be born. But in this long era before spears and blades, the fight remained one of presence and endurance. There was no clean victory, no final conquest. To fight with nothing meant to accept struggle as endless. Survival was never permanent, only borrowed. The human story was written in narrow escapes, in the thin margin between predator and prey. And yet, over thousands of years, that margin grew wider. The very act of enduring again and again was itself a kind of triumph. This is the haunting paradox. Without weapons, we learned the skills that would one day make weapons possible. Endurance taught us patience. Vulnerability taught us unity. Awareness taught us vigilance. And the desperate clutching of stones and sticks in the dark taught us that the world could be reshaped by the human hand. Before weapons, we were already preparing for them through the endless, bare-handed fight to survive. And so, when we ask how humans fought with nothing, the answer is layered. They fought with the body, sweating and running, beyond the limits of other animals. They fought with the voice, raising cries into the night. They fought with the group, standing together when alone they would fall. They fought with the mind, watching, anticipating, enduring. And in each fight, they carved deeper into themselves the truth that would guide our species forever. Survival was not the gift of strength, but the craft of endurance. Yet this reflection leaves us with questions that ripple into the present. What did we lose when weapons replaced voices and unity? Did we forget the old courage of standing empty-handed against the world? Or does that ancient endurance still whisper within us, waiting to be remembered when the tools fail. If endurance and unity were the earliest shields, then imagination was the first blade. Long before stone was sharpened, humans began to see the world not only as it was, but as it could be. The bare hand might have been weak, but the mind behind it was already reaching forward, shaping possibilities. To fight with nothing was not just to endure. It was to begin dreaming of ways to change the odds. Consider again the moment of confrontation, a circle of humans facing a lion. Their hands are empty, their bodies trembling. Yet they do not scatter. They shout, they wave branches, they throw clods of earth. These gestures are not weapons, not yet, but they carry within them a new kind of power, the transformation of fear into theater. Where another animal might freeze or flee, humans invented drama. They painted themselves larger than they were. They cast shadows longer than their bodies. In that space of illusion, the predator hesitated. And hesitation, even for a heartbeat, could mean survival. To fight with nothing was to learn the art of performance. This gift was not only for the moment of danger. In the quiet hours by night, when the predators prowled unseen, humans gathered close and told stories, not with words yet, but with gestures, cries, and rhythms. Perhaps they imitated the leopard's prowl, the eagle's swoop, the hyena's laugh. In these reenactments, knowledge was passed down. Beware the shadow at dusk, beware the wings at noon. But something else was happening too. Fear was not simply endured, it was shared, shaped, and understood. To fight without weapons was also to fight within the mind, against despair, against the loneliness of terror. The story itself became a form of protection. Archaeologists find evidence of this in the earliest traces of symbolic thought. Even before cave paintings, even before carvings, there were patterns of behavior, suggesting that humans were not merely reacting to the world, but reflecting upon it. Some scholars argue that the careful placement of bones or stones in ancient campsites may have carried meaning beyond utility. Whether ritual or remembrance, it points to a profound truth. In the absence of weapons, meaning itself was a shield. To endure was easier if survival felt part of a larger story. And yet, the fight with nothing was not only against predators or storms, it was also against hunger. Without weapons, hunting was a near impossibility. To chase down a gazelle with bare hands was futile. To bring down a buffalo was madness. And so, humans learned another art, patience not only with animals, but with death itself. They scavenged. They waited for lions to finish, then crept forward to strip the leftovers. They cracked bones with stones to reach the marrow the predators left behind. It was a dangerous gamble. Approaching carcasses meant risking confrontation with hyenas or vultures, but hunger drove them forward. To fight without weapons meant to fight constantly for food, to squeeze survival from whatever remained. Yet here, too, the human body had a hidden gift. Unlike other animals, we could eat nearly anything. Fruits, roots, insects, marrow, shellfish. Our digestive system, flexible and resilient, gave us an edge in scarcity. We were not the fastest hunters, but we were the most adaptable scavengers. The fight with nothing was not about glory or conquest. It was about making use of what others ignored. And in this humility lay a strange kind of triumph. Still, there must have been moments when desperation led to astonishing feats. Imagine a group of humans cornering a small animal in a ravine, surrounding it, shouting, throwing stones. No spear pierces it, no arrow flies. But gradually, through confusion and fear, the animal falters, and bare hands close upon it. Perhaps it kicks, bites, resists, but at last it is subdued. The kill is not elegant, it is messy, dangerous, uncertain, yet it feeds the group. In that moment, the empty hand becomes both weapon and tool, not by design, but by raw necessity. Every scratch, every bruise left behind is part of the price of survival. These early struggles etch themselves into memory. We know this because similar practices persist among hunter-gatherers today. In some traditions, animals are driven into traps, into rivers, or toward cliffs, not with weapons, but with coordination and persistence. The weaponless fight of our ancestors echoes in these strategies, reminding us that long before steel or fire, it was the human ability to imagine together, to act together, that turned weakness into strength. But the most haunting question remains. What did these endless battles teach us about ourselves? Did our ancestors, crouched in the grass as hyenas circled, feel only terror? Or did they feel something else, something like defiance? To fight with nothing is to live on the edge of erasure. Every moment might be the last, yet those who survived carried within them not just fear, but a memory of having faced it and endured. Over thousands of years, such memories accumulate until they form something larger, a culture, a spirit, an identity. The weaponless battles shaped not only survival, but the very sense of what it meant to be human. The echoes of those lessons remain even now. Why do humans gather in crowds and cheer together? Why do we tell stories of monsters and heroes? Why do we chant, sing, and shout in unison? Each of these is a shadow of the ancient fight without weapons, when sound, presence, and unity were the only defenses we had. The roar of a stadium, the rhythm of a song, the bravery of a tale told by firelight, all are remnants of the days when we were prey and our voices were our spears. Yet one wonders, what wisdom did we lose when tools finally came? Did the spear teach us confidence but erode the deep humility of facing the world unarmed? Did fire give us security but dim the fierce courage of gathering together in darkness, voices alone standing against the night? And when we crafted blades sharper than any claw, did we forget the ancient truth that survival is not about power alone, but about endurance, unity, and imagination? The story of humanity before weapons is not a tale of conquest. It is a meditation on fragility. It is the memory of a species that should not have survived, yet did, by bending and enduring where others broke. And perhaps that is why the traces of those times still haunt us. We carry within us the fear of predators, the instinct to band together, the restless drive to endure. Beneath every skyscraper and every machine, there still beats the heart of a creature that once stood on the plains with empty hands and chose to fight, to run, to shout, to live. But what of the moment when the empty hand first closed around a stone, not by accident, but by intention? When the branch lifted not just in bluff, but in strike? That moment hovers in the shadows of history, waiting to be told. It was the threshold, the dawn of weapons. Yet even then, the memory of fighting with nothing lingered. For thousands of years before, it was all we knew. And even now, in times when tools fail us, when storms strip away the securities we have built, we are reminded of that older truth, that the first weapon of humanity was not stone or fire, but the will to endure. The silence before dawn must have been the most fragile hour of all. The stars fading, the air cold, the grasses wet with dew. In that stillness, every sound could mean life or death. The crack of a twig, the cough of a leopard, the whisper of something unseen in the tall grass. For humans without weapons, mornings began, not with certainty, but with vigilance. Survival meant rising into a world that did not welcome us, a world that tested us with every step. To fight with nothing was to open your eyes each day knowing you might not see the next, and yet we rose anyway. Our bodies betray this memory even now. The way our eyes catch movement more easily at the edges of vision, the way our skin prickles at the sound of rustling leaves, the way our hearts race in the dark. These are not accidents, they are echoes. They are the residue of countless generations who lived without blades or fire, who carried fear in their bones but did not let it destroy them. Instead, fear became a companion, a constant teacher, It sharpened our senses, stretched our endurance, and reminded us that to live unarmed was to live alert. But fear alone cannot sustain life. To survive, our ancestors learned to weave their fear into strategy. They learned to anticipate the habits of predators, to recognize the patterns of the hunt. Lions ambushed at dawn and dusk. Hyenas circled when darkness was thickest. Crocodiles waited where the river bent. The weaponless fight was often not direct, but preemptive, avoiding, anticipating, outmaneuvering. It was a form of chess played with the wild, and the stakes were existence itself. In this way, the human mind became a kind of shield. Long before it held a spear, it held maps of memory, knowledge passed down through gestures and cries, through stories told by firelight once fire finally came. Yet there were times when avoidance was impossible, when confrontation erupted and the body itself had to bear the cost. Fossil records show fractures healed long after injuries that might have come from falls, kicks, or claws. This suggests something remarkable, that humans cared for one another when injured, tending wounds, feeding the helpless, carrying burdens. Without such compassion, survival would have been fleeting. For an injured hunter or a bitten scavenger could not gather food alone. To fight with nothing, then, was not simply the struggle of individuals. It was the strength of groups. In every healed bone, in every scar carried into old age, lies the story of a community that fought not by claw or tooth, but by care. This communal fight took many forms. When predators pressed too close, the group gathered, raising their voices, waving branches, pelting stones. Not weapons yet, but symbols, extensions of the body that blurred the line between empty-handed and armed. Perhaps this is where the idea of weapons was born, not from the quiet act of carving stone, but from the desperate act of lifting anything at hand to ward off danger. Even the gesture mattered. A branch held high in trembling hands was a declaration. We may be fragile, but we will not surrender easily. Still, the cost was great. Many must have fallen. Children carried off, hunters mauled, elders left behind. The world was merciless, and the balance between survival and extinction hung by a thread. Yet from this crucible, a strange resilience emerged. Humans did not simply endure these losses. They gave them meaning. Perhaps through ritual, perhaps through shared memory, perhaps through stories told in the flicker of firelight when fire at last entered their lives. The fight with nothing was never just physical. It was spiritual. To survive meant to believe that survival mattered, that each life lost fed a greater continuity, a lineage that stretched beyond the individual. This belief may be older than any tool. Some anthropologists suggest that burial practices, however simple, began before agriculture, perhaps even before weapons were refined. To lay a body in the earth, to mark its place with stones or branches, was to declare that life had weight, that death was not mere silence. In this way, even grief became a kind of fight, the refusal to let the wild erase us completely. Where predators devoured and scattered, humans gathered and remembered. Memory itself was a weapon against the void. Hunger remained the most constant battle. Without weapons, hunting was unreliable. Gathering was essential. Hands dug roots from the soil, plucked berries from thorn bushes, cracked shells by the shore. The human diet was not the feast of lions, but the patchwork of survivors. Small things, constant things, the overlooked and the unclaimed. And yet, this very flexibility was an advantage. While predators specialized, humans diversified. We could eat almost anything, and that variety became our quiet strength. To fight with nothing was to fight with adaptability, to transform scarcity into possibility. Still, hunger drove invention. Stones became hammers to break bones. Sticks became probes to dig deeper for roots. These were not yet true weapons, but they were gestures toward them, signs that the hand could change the world it touched. The boundary between fighting empty-handed and fighting armed was not a sudden leap, but a slow blur stretched across millennia. And yet, even as these first tools emerged, the memory of fighting bare remained. The human spirit was shaped not by the security of weapons, but by the long, desperate age before them. What did that age teach us? That survival depends less on strength than on endurance. That unity outlasts isolation. That imagination reshapes fear into strategy. And perhaps most importantly, that life is not secured by domination, but by persistence. These truths, carved into us by centuries of weaponless struggle, still echo beneath our modern certainties. We live now in cities, surrounded by tools so advanced they seem like magic. But in moments of crisis, when the lights go out, when storms rage, when systems fail, we return to those older instincts. We huddle together, we listen for danger, we endure. It is worth asking, what wisdom did we leave behind when weapons finally arrived? Did we forget the patience of waiting out a predator in silence, the humility of scavenging after stronger beasts, the fierce courage of raising voices together in the night? Did the spear, the blade, the fire make us stronger? Or did they make us forget the strength we once carried in endurance alone? Perhaps the most haunting truth is this. Humanity's first victories were not about killing. They were about surviving without killing. To fight with nothing was to resist, to endure, to persist, not to conquer. Our earliest triumphs were measured not in corpses, but in continuance. We lived where we should not have lived. We endured where extinction seemed certain. That, more than any sharpened stone, was the foundation of our species. And so, when we imagine those distant mornings on the savannah, when a group of humans rose with empty hands to face a dangerous world, we should not see only weakness. We should see the roots of our deepest strength. For in those trembling hands lay not just fear, but the first sparks of courage, unity, imagination, and hope. The fight with nothing shaped us long before we learned to shape stone. It was the crucible in which humanity was forged, and even now, across all the centuries, that echo remains. Beneath every tool we hold, beneath every weapon we wield, there is still the memory of a bare hand lifted against the dark, refusing to surrender, whispering the first defiance of our kind. We are here. We endure. When we think of a fight, we imagine a clash. Bodies colliding, blows exchanged, victory claimed. But for early humans without weapons, fighting was often something different, something quieter. It was not about triumph in a single moment, but about surviving another day, another week, another season. It was the long fight, stretched across years, waged not in the glory of combat, but in the stubbornness of existence. To fight with nothing was not always to strike. It was to endure, again and again, until the world yielded. Endurance took many forms. One of the most overlooked was persistence hunting, chasing an animal not with speed, not with claws, but with time. Under the merciless African sun, other predators rested. Humans did not. Step after step, hour after hour, they followed. They could not catch the antelope in a sprint, but they could follow it until its legs buckled, until its breath broke, until exhaustion itself became the invisible weapon. What claws could not achieve, patience could. And so, the fight without weapons was also the invention of a new kind of hunting, the hunt of endurance, the triumph of the slow but relentless. In this, we glimpse something profound. Weakness transformed into strength. Our lack of fur, which left us exposed to cold nights, allowed us to sweat and cool our bodies in the heat of day. Our upright stance, clumsy against trees, gave us longer strides across open plains. What seemed like flaws became advantages when stretched across hours of pursuit. The body itself, reshaped by evolution, was already a tool of persistence. To fight with nothing was to discover that even fragility could be turned into power if wielded with patience. But hunting was only part of the struggle. More often, survival meant defense. Defense against those who hunted us. Fossils tell the story clearly. Puncture wounds from big cats, fractures that suggest falls during escapes, bones bearing the marks of attack. For early humans, every predator was a teacher. They learned not only to endure, but to anticipate. Hyenas struck at night, leopards ambushed from trees, crocodiles waited in silence. Over generations, this knowledge became instinct. Our eyes sharpened to catch the flicker of movement. Our ears tuned to distant growls. Our minds carried maps of danger, rehearsing scenarios long before they unfolded. This rehearsal of fear, this living readiness, became its own kind of weapon. To fight with nothing meant to be prepared, always. It was not a choice, but a condition of existence. And perhaps it is why, even today, our bodies flood with adrenaline at shadows, why we fear what we cannot see. We inherited the vigilance of the weaponless, the hyper-awareness that kept them alive when a single mistake meant death. Every time our heart quickens in darkness, we are reliving the ancient fight. And yet, for all the dangers, for all the terror of predators, the greatest challenge may have been one another. Food was scarce, and groups competed. Without weapons, conflict among humans did not take the form of great battles, but of tension, displays, posturing, and bluff. Like other primates, early humans likely used shows of dominance, loud voices, flung objects, threatening gestures, to avoid direct violence that could leave both sides wounded. Here, too, we see the theater of survival, the fight not to kill, but to intimidate, to win without striking. It was a fragile balance, but one that allowed groups to coexist long enough to endure. These confrontations also reveal something else, the beginning of strategy. To survive without weapons was to rely on cunning as much as courage. A group might distract a predator while others escaped. They might lure an animal into mud or water. They might circle silently around scavengers to claim what remained. Such acts required planning, coordination, imagination. They were not instinct alone, but the flicker of something uniquely human, foresight. The fight with nothing was already teaching us to think beyond the moment, to plan for futures not yet seen. And in this planning lies the seed of culture. For what is culture if not the shared memory of how to endure? Every strategy, once used, could be remembered, retold, repeated. A child learned not only by experience, but by watching, by listening. Stories of danger became maps for survival. In this way, even before the first true weapons, knowledge itself was the sharpest edge humans possessed. Memory was the first blade, carried not in the hand, but in the mind. But imagine the toll. Every strategy was born from trial, and every trial cost lives. For each successful persistence hunt, how many ended in collapse from thirst? For each confrontation survived, how many ended with bodies carried away by predators? For each new lesson, how many deaths carved it into memory? To fight with nothing was to pay in blood for every fragment of knowledge. Survival was not given, it was purchased again and again at the edge of loss. This is perhaps why humans began to weave meaning into suffering. Ritual, early burial, shared mourning. These were not luxuries, but necessities. Without them, the constant presence of death would have shattered the spirit. 2. Fight with nothing was also to fight against despair, to transform loss into continuity. A life ended became a lesson, a memory, a story. The group endured because meaning endured. And through all of this, a pattern emerges. Humans without weapons did not survive by strength, but by transformation. They transformed weakness into endurance, fear into vigilance, fragility into unity, loss into meaning. Each transformation was a victory, quiet but profound. And each victory prepared the way for what would come next. The leap into tools and weapons, the age when the empty hand finally closed around something more. But even as that leap approached, the memory of the weaponless fight lingered. Perhaps it is why, even now, we are drawn to stories of underdogs, of the fragile overcoming the mighty, of the defenseless who endure. They are echoes of our own beginning, of the long ages when we stood unarmed against the world and somehow survived. So when we ask, how did humans fight with nothing? The answer is both simple and profound. They fought by refusing to vanish. They fought by turning every weakness into a strategy, every loss into a lesson, every fear into vigilance. They fought not to dominate, but to endure. And in that endurance lay the foundation of all that followed. Yet one question lingers, haunting the threshold of history. What did we lose when the first stone was sharpened? Did we abandon the patience, the humility, the unity of the weaponless age? Or do those older strengths still live within us, waiting, silent beneath the clamor of steel? The dawn of tools hovers like a shadow just beyond the horizon of this story. We know it is coming, for stone flakes and bone fragments begin to appear in the record, silent testimonies to a new age. But before that threshold is crossed, there was still a long, precarious stretch of existence in which the fight was bare. It is easy to forget how long that age endured. Millions of years when the human hand was empty, when survival depended not on what we shaped, but on what we were. And what we were, above all else, was vulnerable. The fossil record reminds us with merciless clarity. At Swartkrans in South Africa, bones of early hominins bear puncture marks left by leopards. At Olduvai Gorge, skulls reveal fractures that suggest violent encounters, not with tools, but with predators, or falls during desperate escapes. Time and again, the evidence points to a truth we might prefer to ignore. We were prey before we were hunters. The fight with nothing was not a march of triumph, but a long series of escapes, evasions, and narrow survivals. Yet there is power, even in vulnerability. To live as prey is to learn attentiveness. To endure constant threat is to cultivate memory. And to be fragile is to discover strength, not in domination, but in persistence. Every scar on those ancient bones, every healed fracture, is a record of resilience. The body broke, but it mended. The spirit faltered, but it rose. The group suffered, but it continued. Vulnerability, paradoxically, was the forge in which humanity's endurance was tempered. Consider how our ancestors must have gathered at night. There was no fire yet, only darkness, pressing close, alive with the movements of unseen predators. They sat together, listening, whispering, perhaps humming in low tones to reassure one another. Every rustle in the grass could be a threat. Every distant growl could signal danger. And yet they did not scatter into the darkness. They stayed. They endured the night together. That act alone, the choice to remain as a group in the face of fear, was a kind of defiance. To fight with nothing was often not to strike, but simply to hold one's ground against the overwhelming silence. This act of holding ground may be the earliest form of courage. It was not dramatic. It left no artifact, but it left an imprint in our bodies, in our instincts, in our stories. We still gather in groups when afraid. We still feel comfort in the presence of others. We still sing, chant, and tell stories to push back the weight of fear. These are not modern habits. They are echoes of the weaponless age, when survival depended on unity more than on arms. But unity was fragile too. Groups sometimes split under pressure. Scarcity drove conflict. Competition for food, for shelter, for safety could erupt into violence. Yet even here, the fight with nothing shaped human nature. Without weapons, violence could not escalate endlessly. Fists, nails, teeth, these were brutal but limited. A fight could wound, but it rarely destroyed an entire group. Instead, Displays of dominance, threats, and bluffs were often enough. Much like chimpanzees today, our ancestors likely relied on intimidation more than killing. The absence of weapons forced a balance. To fight with nothing was also to discover restraint. Restraint, in turn, gave space for cooperation to flourish. Anthropologists suggest that cooperation among early humans may have been the decisive factor in survival. A lone human could not fend off a lion, but 10 shouting, stone-throwing humans might. A single injured hunter could not gather food, but a group could feed them until they healed. In this way, the weaponless fight cultivated something extraordinary: dependence upon one another. Without it, no lineage could have survived. With it, humans began to weave the threads of society. This society was not yet built on villages or farms. It was fragile, shifting, nomadic. Small bands moved across landscapes, following herds, tracking seasons, scavenging where they could. But even in this fluid existence, the seeds of culture were sown. Songs to drive away predators, gestures to warn of danger, rituals to remember the dead. To fight with nothing was to live in a world where meaning itself was a weapon, where the invisible bonds of trust and memory held the group together when everything else threatened to tear it apart. Hunger, always hunger, remained the sharpest edge of this fight. To live without weapons was to walk the razor's edge of starvation. A failed scavenging trip, a dry season, a scarcity of roots and berries, any of these could bring disaster. And yet hunger, too, shaped us. It drove innovation. It forced flexibility. It taught us to widen our diets, to eat what others could not, to adapt to new environments. Where predators specialized, humans diversified. Hunger turned us into generalists, able to find sustenance in almost any land. In this way, the emptiness of the hand gave rise to the fullness of the mind. And still, hunger created desperation. Imagine a group trailing a wounded antelope, exhausted from a chase. They have no spears to finish it, no knives to cut it open. They must wrestle it down with their bare hands, risk its hooves, its horns, its frantic strength. The kill is not swift. It is dangerous, bloody, chaotic. But at last, the animal collapses, and for a brief time, there is meat to share. Every bite carries the memory of risk. Every meal is stained with the knowledge of how close to failure survival truly is. To fight with nothing was to live with this constant reminder. Life was always borrowed, never guaranteed. These lessons, carried across countless generations, became the foundation of the human spirit. We often imagined that weapons gave us mastery over the world. But in truth, the qualities that made us human were forged in the long ages before weapons existed. Endurance, vigilance, cooperation, restraint, imagination, these were not born from stone blades. They were born from the empty hand, from the desperate fight to survive without them. And perhaps this is why, even now, in moments when our tools fail us, we return to those older instincts. When storms cut the power, we gather with neighbors. When systems collapse, we improvise, adapt, endure. When fear closes in, we reach for one another. These are not modern strategies. They are ancient echoes. Beneath every skyscraper and every machine, there still beats the heart of a creature who once stood, unarmed, against the darkness. But as we approach the dawn of weapons, we must ask, what was lost when the empty hand first closed around sharpened stone? Did we carry forward the endurance, the humility, the unity of the weaponless age? Or did we trade them for a new path, one of conquest, of domination, of blades sharper than memory? The weaponless age lasted far longer than the age of tools has so far. It shaped us more deeply than we often realize. And though it is hidden now beneath layers of technology and civilization, it remains the silent bedrock of what we are. To fight with nothing was the first and greatest lesson of humanity, that survival depends not on power, but on persistence. that life endures not because it conquers, but because it refuses to vanish. And so the story turns. The empty hand begins to close around stones. The branch, once raised in bluff, begins to harden into spear. The threshold is near. But before we cross it, we must remember it was the long ages without weapons that taught us how to survive, how to endure, how to imagine. The weapons that came later were only reflections of the spirit already forged in the darkness. The empty hand was never truly empty. Even before it grasped stone with intent, even before it carved wood into shape, the hand itself was already the most improbable of instruments. Long fingers, delicate bones, opposable thumbs. Our hands could not strike like a fist of a chimpanzee, nor tear like the claws of a cat, but they could hold, shape, and gesture. They could point to danger, cradle an infant, gather berries, and carry meaning in their movements. The hand was weak as a weapon, but infinite as a tool. And in that paradox lay the seed of humanity's future. To fight with nothing was not only about the body or the voice, it was also about the hand's potential. Imagine the countless times an ancestor lifted a stone, not to strike, but to crack a nut. The sound of impact, the reward of food. It was a lesson etched into memory. Over time, the gesture repeated, refined, passed down. What began as an act of gathering became the earliest spark of shaping. It was not yet weaponry, but it was the first step toward it, for in every stone lifted, in every branch bent, the possibility of transformation waited. And yet, for countless generations, the hand remained bare in battle. When predators came too close, it waved sticks, hurled dirt, threw unshaped stones. These were not tools, not weapons, but extensions of fear turned outward. In this way, the weaponless fight slowly blurred into the beginnings of armament. The difference was subtle, but profound. A stick picked up in panic was not a spear, but it hinted at one. A stone flung in anger was not a crafted blade, but it pointed toward what might one day be. The archaeological record confirms this slow dance of possibility. At sites like Gona in Ethiopia, simple stone flakes dating back more than 2.5 million years reveal that hominins began to strike stone against stone to create sharp edges. These were not weapons at first, but tools for cutting meat from carcasses, scraping hides, cracking bones for marrow. Yet, in the act of shaping stone, a new frontier opened. The empty hand became a hand that could alter its own world. From that moment, the line between tool and weapon was only a matter of time. But before that line was crossed fully, humans lived in a liminal space, part prey, part hunter, part vulnerable, part cunning. The fight with nothing continued, but it carried with it the ghost of something more. Every time a stone flake sliced through sinew, every time a branch was sharpened by accident, the idea grew clearer. Perhaps the hand itself could be armed. The predator had always been stronger in body, but now the prey had imagination. Yet imagination was not enough on its own. The fight with nothing was still the daily reality. Leopards did not wait for stone flakes. Hyenas did not care for the promise of future spears. To live in that time was to walk the edge of possibility, armed in spirit, unarmed in flesh. And perhaps this tension shaped us more than any invention that followed. For it forced us to endure both the weakness of today and the vision of tomorrow. It forced us to hold in our minds two truths at once, that we were fragile and that we could be more. Consider the group encamped near a carcass, waiting for the lions to leave. They have sharp flakes now, crude but effective. They cut, they scrape, they eat. But when the lions return, when shadows flicker in the grass, those flakes are useless, too small, too fragile. The group still shouts, waves branches, throws stones. The weaponless fight is not yet over. Tools feed them, but tools do not yet protect them. The empty hand has begun to change, but its transformation is incomplete. This in-between world lasted for millennia. The first tools were helpers, not guardians. They eased hunger, but did not banish fear. To fight with nothing still defined the nights, the sudden ambushes, the desperate flights through the grass. And perhaps it was this long twilight, this extended waiting at the threshold, that made the eventual leap into weaponry so powerful. Humans had lived for millions of years unarmed. They had endured against impossible odds. When the first true weapon finally appeared, it was not simply a tool of stone or wood. It was the culmination of an ancient longing, the embodiment of a survival instinct honed in the weaponless dark. But before that leap, the empty hand had more lessons to teach. For one of the most extraordinary aspects of this age was the discovery that fighting with nothing could sometimes mean not fighting at all. Avoidance, patience, cunning, these were often stronger than confrontation. To circle around predators instead of challenging them. To wait for scavengers to finish instead of attacking them. To endure hunger one more day rather than risk death for food. These were not acts of cowardice, but of wisdom. The weaponless fight was as much about restraint as about defiance. That restraint shaped the human psyche. Even today, we value patience, strategy, endurance, not merely raw power. We tell stories not only of heroes who conquered, but also of those who outlasted, who endured trials that seemed unbearable. This narrative thread, woven deep into our cultural fabric, stretches back to those long nights when endurance itself was victory. Before weapons, survival was not about triumph, but about persistence. And so the story circles back to the paradox. Humanity, the weakest of hunters, became the most enduring of survivors. Not because of claws, not because of strength, not even because of tools, at least not at first, but because of an unyielding spirit that refused to vanish. The fight with nothing was not merely a chapter in our past. It was the crucible in which our essence was forged. Still, the shadow of the future pressed closer. Every time a stone flake cut deeper than a fingernail could, every time a branch held longer than a hand, the boundary shifted. The weaponless fight was teaching us slowly how to arm ourselves. But even as weapons approached, the memory of the bare hand lingered. For millions of years, it was all we had. And even when weapons came, they were built upon the lessons of those empty hands. Endurance, unity, restraint, imagination. So let us pause here on the threshold of that transformation and ask, what did it mean to live so long unarmed? What did it mean to walk the earth as prey, to endure storms, hunger, predators, and despair with nothing but the body and the group? What did it mean to survive, not by domination, but by persistence? Perhaps it means this, that humanity was never defined by weapons, but by the refusal to give up before we had them. That the story of our species is not the story of conquest, but of endurance. That before we learn to kill, we learn to live. And maybe that is why, even now, when stripped of our machines and tools, we still find ways to endure. When disaster strikes, when systems fail, when weapons cannot protect us, we return to older instincts. We gather, we adapt, we persist. The weaponless fight is not gone. It sleeps within us, waiting. A reminder that the true strength of humanity has never been the blade in our hand, but the will in our spirit. There must have been a first moment when the empty hand became something more. Not the casual lifting of a branch in panic, not the blind flinging of a stone, but a deliberate choice, a hand that shaped the world into a tool meant for protection, meant for striking. That moment is lost to us, hidden in the soil of millennia. Yet its weight is immeasurable. For it was the instant when humanity began to move from fighting with nothing to fighting with something. It was the hinge upon which all later history would turn. And yet, even as that hinge creaked open, the weaponless fight lingered. For the earliest tools were fragile things, flakes of stone sharp enough to cut flesh, but too small to guard against a lion. Branches pointed crudely into spears, but too weak to pierce thick hide. The empty hand was still exposed, still trembling in the dark. The fight with nothing did not end suddenly. It faded slowly, overlapping with the dawning of weapons, each generation learning to trust the tool a little more, even as the old habits of endurance and unity remained essential. Archaeological traces tell the story with quiet precision. At sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya, great accumulations of hand axes, over 800,000 years old, mark the shift toward deliberate shaping of stone. These axes could cut meat, scrape hides, dig soil. Some may even have been used to strike, but their presence in such vast numbers suggests something more than utility. They were symbols of a new age, an age when the hand was no longer bare. Still, it is important to remember, for countless generations before such tools spread widely, humans survived without them. What did that first sharpened stone mean to those who held it? Perhaps relief, perhaps pride, perhaps even fear. To carry in the hand something sharper than the nail, something harder than bone, was to step into an unknown. Would it make survival easier? Or would it awaken dangers unforeseen? For weapons do not only defend, they invite confrontation, escalate conflict, transform relationships. To fight with nothing had taught restraint, had taught endurance, had taught avoidance. To fight with something would be to learn an entirely new way of being. And yet at first, nothing changed too quickly. The stone flake, the hand axe, the pointed stick, these were still fragile. Predators remained stronger. The nights remained long. The fight with nothing was still the daily reality. But now, for the first time, there was a whisper of possibility that the balance could shift. It was not a revolution, but a seed. We might imagine a scene. A group of humans encounters a scavenging hyena over a carcass. In the past, they would have shouted, waved, thrown unshaped stones. But this time, one holds a sharpened branch. When the hyena lunges, the branch thrusts forward. Perhaps it wounds, perhaps it startles, perhaps it breaks. The encounter is no longer only bluff and noise. There is force behind the gesture now, substance behind the theater. Even if the outcome is uncertain, something fundamental has changed. The empty hand is no longer entirely empty. But the long habit of fighting with nothing did not vanish in this moment. It continued to shape the way humans use their new tools. We did not become reckless hunters overnight. We did not suddenly dominate the plains. Instead, we remained cautious, enduring, strategic. The lessons of the weaponless age were not forgotten. They were carried forward into the age of weapons. The spear was not a replacement for endurance, but an addition. The stone blade was not a substitute for cooperation, but a complement. In this way, the weaponless fight lived on, even as tools multiplied. It is worth pausing here to reflect on what weapons really meant. To fight with nothing was to exist in a world of limits, limits of strength, limits of speed, limits of flesh. Those limits shaped humility. They taught us patience, restraint, community. But the moment weapons entered our hands, those limits began to loosen. The fragile body could extend its reach, harden its edge, project its power. For the first time, humans could imagine not only enduring, but overcoming. This was both a gift and a danger. For in loosening the bonds of weakness, weapons also loosened the bonds of humility. Yet in the earliest days, humility still dominated. The first weapons were unreliable, breakable, awkward. They could fail at the crucial moment. A stick could splinter. A stone could slip. The weaponless fight still lay just beneath the surface, reminding humans not to trust too fully in the objects they carried. For centuries, perhaps millennia, the human story was one of balance. 1 foot in the old world of endurance, 1 foot in the new world of invention. And this balance is perhaps the most important truth of all. We often imagine history as a series of sudden leaps, from nothing to something, from prey to hunter, from weakness to dominance. But in reality, change was slow, overlapping, tangled. The fight with nothing did not end with the first stone blade. It lingered, shaping the way weapons were used, reminding humans of their fragility even as they reached for strength. This lingering explains why, even today, we still carry the instincts of the weaponless age. We still feel fear in the dark, even though our cities are lit. We still gather in groups when threatened, even though we hold machines that can kill at a distance. We still tell stories of endurance, of underdogs, of fragile heroes who outlast stronger foes. These are not modern inventions. They are the echoes of the long, weaponless struggle, carried forward into every age. And so, as we cross this threshold in our story, we must not forget what lies behind us. The Age of Nothing was not an empty prelude. It was the foundation of everything that followed. It taught us endurance, unity, imagination, restraint, and the value of meaning in the face of despair. Without those lessons, weapons would have been useless, for weapons alone do not guarantee survival. It was the spirit forged in the weaponless fight that gave weapons their power. But as weapons took root, a new chapter began, one filled with possibilities both wondrous and terrible. For the first time, humans could confront predators not only with bluff, but with real force. For the first time, they could imagine killing from a distance, striking harder than their hands allowed. For the first time, the balance of fear began to tilt. And yet, even as this dawn rose, the night of the weaponless age still lingered behind it, whispering its old lessons into the ears of those who carried the first blades. Perhaps that is the paradox we must carry forward. Humanity was shaped most deeply, not by its weapons, but by the long stretch of time before them. The empty hand, trembling in the dark, taught us to endure. The sharpened stone, lifted in defiance, built upon that endurance. Together, they tell the story of what it means to be human, not simply to conquer, but to persist, to imagine, to transform weakness into strength. The first true weapons did not arrive with a roar, but with a whisper, a sharpened stick hardened in fire, a stone lashed to wood, a flake of obsidian that cut deeper than bone. These were not dramatic inventions. They were humble, fragile, imperfect. Yet their meaning was profound. For the first time, the human body was no longer the only line of defense. The empty hand, so long exposed, now carried something sharper, harder, more enduring than flesh. The long age of fighting with nothing was not yet over, but it was beginning to give way to something entirely new. What changed first was confidence. To stand before a predator, armed only with voice and bluff, was one thing. To stand with a pointed branch in hand was another. The difference may have been small. No stick could match a lion's claw, but the psychological weight was immense. To carry a weapon was to feel that survival was not entirely at the mercy of the world. It was to feel, however faintly, that the odds could be bent. That feeling itself, perhaps, was as important as the weapon's edge. But weapons did more than change the balance of fear between humans and predators. They also transformed the balance among humans themselves. In the weaponless age, fights between groups were dangerous but limited. Fists, nails, and teeth could wound, but rarely did they wipe out entire bands. With weapons, however, violence could escalate. A sharpened spear could kill swiftly. A stone blade could cut deeply. The same tools that protected against lions could also turn against neighbors. The weaponless fight had taught restraint, but now restraint faced new tests. To wield a weapon was to carry not only power, but temptation. This paradox, protection and peril bound together, defined the dawn of weaponry. On the one hand, humans could finally hunt more effectively. With spears, they could bring down animals too fast to catch with bare hands. With blades, they could butcher carcasses quickly, preserving more food before scavengers arrived. Hunting became less about endless pursuit and more about planning, ambush, coordination. On the other hand, the same weapons that made hunting easier made conflict more lethal. What had once been displays of noise and posture could now end in blood. The world became safer and more dangerous at once. Archaeology bears silent witness to this change. At Schöningen in Germany, wooden spears more than 300,000 years old have been found, carefully shaped and balanced. These were not crude sticks. They were deliberate, intentional weapons, designed for thrusting or throwing. Their survival across the millennia speaks to the care with which they were crafted. They were not accidents of panic. They were the products of minds that had moved beyond improvisation into design. The empty hand had become something else entirely, an instrument of invention, an architect of force. Yet even as weapons spread, the lessons of the weaponless age did not disappear. Endurance remained vital. Cooperation remained essential. The spear was powerful, but only in the hands of many. To face a mammoth, to confront a bison, to surround an antelope, humans needed one another as much as they ever had. The weaponless fight had taught unity, and weapons only magnified its necessity. A lone hunter with a spear was still fragile. A group of hunters with spears was something new. The empty hand had become armed, but it was still strongest when joined with others. And so the rhythm of life shifted. Nights grew a little less fearful, for fire and weapons together could hold predators at bay. Hunts grew a little more ambitious, for spears could pierce where bare hands failed, but fear never vanished. The weaponless age was too long, too deep in the bones to be erased by sharpened sticks. Even with weapons, humans slept lightly. Even with fire, they listened for rustles in the dark. Even with blades, they remembered what it was to be prey. The memory of fighting with nothing lingered, shaping how weapons were used. Cautiously, collectively, strategically. What weapons changed most was not simply survival, but imagination. If a stick could be sharpened, what else could be shaped? If a stone could be lashed to wood, what else could be combined? The leap from nothing to something unlocked a cascade of invention. Tools became weapons, weapons became symbols, symbols became stories. To carry a spear was not only to fight, but to embody possibility. For the first time, humans could imagine shaping not just their environment, but their fate. Yet with imagination came questions that still haunt us. Did weapons make us stronger, or did they make us forget the older strengths of patience and restraint? Did they free us from fear, or did they bind us to new cycles of violence? Did they elevate humanity, or did they awaken parts of us better left asleep? These questions cannot be answered easily, for weapons were both salvation and burden. They preserved us from extinction, and they gave us new ways to destroy one another. Still, in those early days, perhaps the shadow of destruction was not yet clear. To the first hands that carried spears, weapons must have seemed like miracles. They turned hunger into plenty. They turned fear into defiance. They turned fragility into force. The weaponless age had been endless struggle. The armed age promised something different, something almost unthinkable. Choice. For the first time, humans could choose not only to endure, but to confront, not only to persist, but to prevail. But even then, the old lessons whispered beneath the new. The spear was powerful, but it could break. The blade was sharp, but it could dull. The weaponless fight had taught humility, and that humility kept early humans cautious. They did not dominate the world overnight. They did not sweep predators from the earth. They continued to endure, to adapt, to imagine. Weapons were not the end of the story, but another thread woven into it. The true foundation remained the same. Unity, vigilance, endurance. And perhaps this is the deepest truth. The weaponless age was not erased by weapons. It was carried forward within them. Every spear still required the patience of persistence hunting. Every blade still required the cooperation of groups. Every strike still required the vigilance of prey. Weapons did not replace the old lessons. They amplified them. Humanity did not leap into dominance. It grew slowly, carrying its old fragilities into its new powers. The story of fighting with nothing does not end when weapons appear. It continues within them as a memory, a foundation, a warning. For even now, in our age of machines and technologies far beyond stone and wood, we still carry the instincts of the weaponless fight. We still endure together in times of crisis. We still fear the dark. We still tell stories of the fragile who survive. The empty hand may now hold steel, but it still remembers what it was to be bare. So as we stand at this point in the story, on the far side of the threshold with the first true weapons in hand, we must pause to reflect. What did we gain when the empty hand was armed, and what did we lose? Did weapons free us from fear, or did they bind us to a new kind of fear, the fear of ourselves? Did they grant us mastery, or did they only reveal the cost of seeking it? The answers are not simple. They ripple across time, echoing in every battle fought, every tool shaped, every story told. But one truth is certain. Before weapons, we had already learned how to survive. The empty hand had already given us endurance, unity, imagination. Weapons were not the birth of humanity. They were the echo of what humanity already was. What does it mean to say that humanity once fought with nothing? It is tempting to dismiss it as a primitive chapter, a prelude quickly erased by the arrival of tools and fire. But the truth is deeper, more haunting. The weaponless age lasted far longer than the age of weapons has so far. For millions of years, the empty hand was our only companion. For millions of years, we endured without claws, without blades, without armor. It was in that long, fragile crucible that the essence of humanity was forged. Weapons may have changed our fate, but they did not create us. They came late, almost as an afterthought. By the time the first spear was sharpened, we had already learned the most vital lessons. We had learned endurance, walking farther and longer than predators could follow. We had learned unity, gathering together when alone we would fall. We had learned imagination, shaping fear into strategy, turning weakness into theater, weaving meaning into suffering. We had learned restraint, avoiding fights we could not win, surviving through patience instead of strength. These were not gifts of weapons. They were the legacy of the weaponless fight. Even now, those lessons linger in us. Our bodies carry them. Our hearts race at sudden sounds because our ancestors once listened for predators in the dark. Our skin prickles with fear because their lives depended on vigilance. Our muscles can run not the fastest sprint, but the longest distance, because persistence was once our greatest weapon. Our voices still rise together in chants, in songs, in cries, because sound was once our shield against the night. We are modern beings, surrounded by tools beyond imagining, but we remain children of the weaponless age, and our cultures too bear its echoes. We tell stories of underdogs, of the fragile who endure against impossible odds. We celebrate patience, strategy, cleverness, the very qualities that allowed us to survive when the hand was bare. We remember heroes not only for their victories, but for their endurance. We still honor those who protect, who unify, who carry others when they cannot walk. These are not accidents. They are inheritances. They are the old lessons, carried forward across the centuries, whispered to us by ancestors who lived without spears or blades. But we must also reckon with what was lost. Weapons gave us strength, but they also gave us new forms of fear. In the weaponless age, death came from outside, from predators, from storms, from hunger. With weapons, death could come from one another. The empty hand could only intimidate. The armed hand could kill. The restraint taught by weakness now had to contend with the temptation of power. And so began a new chapter in human history. Conflict not only with the world, but within ourselves. Yet perhaps this too was inevitable. For the same imagination that turned branches into spears also turned spears against neighbors. The same endurance that chased prey across plains also carried wars across continents. The same unity that protected against lions could be twisted into armies. Weapons changed us, yes, but only because they amplified what was already within us. They gave shape to both our noblest qualities and our darkest shadows. Still, the question remains, what wisdom can we reclaim from the weaponless age? What truths, buried beneath millennia of blades and machines, still matter? Perhaps it is this, that survival is not the gift of strength, but the craft of persistence. That the fragile can endure longer than the mighty. That to be human is not to dominate, but to refuse to vanish. The weaponless fight was never about conquest, it was about endurance. Every scar healed in an ancient bone, every night survived without fire, every carcass scavenged from predators. All were victories of persistence, not power. And in those quiet victories lies a message for us today. For though our weapons have changed, our fragility has not. We remain vulnerable to storms, to hunger, to disease, to one another. Our machines are vast, but the human body is still frail. The lessons of the weaponless age are not obsolete. They are reminders of what we truly are. Imagine for a moment the first human who lifted a sharpened spear in the dawn light. Around them stretched the memory of millions of years of empty hands, millions of years of fear and endurance. They were not only holding wood and stone, they were holding the inheritance of all who had come before. Every ancestor who had shouted in the dark, every group that had stood together against predators, every fragile body that had endured hunger and fear, all were present in that moment. The spear was not the beginning, it was the echo of a story already written. And so the circle closes. We began with nothing. We endured with nothing. We transformed weakness into strength, fragility into persistence, fear into imagination. Weapons came later, but they were only tools. The true weapon of humanity was never the spear, never the blade, never the fire. It was the spirit of endurance. It was the refusal to surrender. It was the gathering of fragile bodies into communities that outlasted predators and storms. That, more than any invention, is why we are here. Perhaps this is the final paradox, that the greatest power humanity ever wielded was discovered when we had none at all. That before we armed our hands, we armed our hearts. That before we sharpened stone, we sharpened courage. That before we wielded blades, we wielded endurance. And so, as the story ends, we must ask ourselves, what would it mean to remember those lessons today? What would it mean to live as though endurance mattered more than domination, as though unity mattered more than conquest, as though imagination mattered more than fear? These are not ancient questions, they are timeless ones. For in every crisis, in every trial, in every moment when the tools fail and the world presses close, we return to the same truth that our ancestors carried. The empty hand, trembling in the dark, is enough. If it is joined by others, if it is guided by patience, if it refuses to let go. That is how we survived then, and that is how we survive now. The weaponless fight is not gone. It lives within us still, in our instincts, in our stories, in our endurance. It whispers through time, reminding us that before we fought with something, we fought with nothing, and that was enough.